Doctor refuses to operate on uninsured man, then finds out his true identity. Imagine being in a dire medical emergency, unable to afford the life-saving surgery you need. The hospital, the place you thought would help you, refuses to give you the care you desperately require. But what if, just moments before it's too late, they find out who you truly are? This story is about a man who was overlooked, dismissed, and refused care because of his lack of insurance. But his identity would change everything, teaching us the lessons of humility, empathy, and the true value of a person beyond their wealth. The sterile white walls of St. Michael's Hospital gleamed under the fluorescent lights. It was a place where lives were saved, where miracles happened, and where people came to heal. Yet, like so many hospitals across the country, it was also a place where the system was imperfect. St. Michael's, despite its prestigious reputation, was no exception. In one of the emergency rooms, a man lay on a gurney, clutching his side in agony. His face was pale, sweat beading on his forehead, but he was trying to remain calm. His name was Mark, a 45-year-old mechanic who worked long hours at a small auto repair shop. He wasn't rich, and in fact, he barely made enough to cover the basics for his family. He wasn't one to ask for help, and certainly not from a hospital. But that day, when his chest pain became unbearable, he had no choice. He was rushed to the ER by a concerned co-worker. As the doctors moved around him, assessing his condition, Mark could feel the weight of the situation on him. He knew something was seriously wrong. He could barely catch his breath, his heart seemed to be racing out of control, and his side felt like it was on fire. "I'm sorry, but we're going to need you to fill out some forms," a nurse told him gently. Mark nodded weakly as the nurse handed him the clipboard. He barely had the strength to hold the pen, but he managed. He could feel a lump in his throat as he reached the insurance section. I'm uninsured," he whispered, feeling a deep sense of shame. The nurse looked up, her face a mix of sympathy and concern. "I'll let the doctor know." Minutes later, the emergency room doors opened, and in walked Dr. William Parker, a middle-aged man with short-cropped hair, glasses perched on his nose, and a white lab coat that was neat, but bore the wear of long shifts. Dr. Parker was well known at St. Michael's. He was skilled, respected, and well-established in his field. He'd saved many lives, but like many doctors in large hospitals, he was also focused on efficiency. Time was precious, and resources were limited. "Mr. Lopez," Dr. Parker greeted him, looking down at the file in his hand. "It looks like you're experiencing some chest pain. We're going to need to run some tests, but it seems like a heart issue." Mark's eyes widened. Heart issue. He was terrified. "Doc, I don't have insurance. I can't afford this." Dr. Parker glanced over at the nurse, who seemed to hesitate for a moment, before returning his attention to Mark. "I'm sorry, Mr. Lopez," Dr. Parker said, his voice cold and clinical. "Without insurance, we can't move forward with the necessary tests or surgery. It's hospital policy. You'll have to look for alternative care." Mark's heart sank. The pain in his chest intensified. "But I need help, Doc. I can't breathe. I can't." "I understand, but without coverage, I can't do anything for you," Dr. Parker replied, his voice growing more distant. "I suggest you get your insurance situation sorted out, or you'll have to leave." With that, the doctor turned to leave. Mark watched him go, his head spinning. How could they just turn him away like this? He was a person, wasn't he? Wasn't his life worth saving? The nurse looked at Mark with a mix of pity and regret. "I'm sorry, I wish we could do more." Mark felt a lump in his throat. He didn't know what to do. He couldn't pay for treatment, and no one would help him. Alone and in pain, he was left with nothing but the desperate hope that somehow, something would change. Just as Mark began to feel like giving up, a strange thought crossed his mind. Could he make it through this alone? He'd been through so much in his life. He'd worked hard, struggled, and made do with whatever he had. He couldn't let his family suffer. Not now. But still, the fear gnawed at him. Would he die alone in a hospital that refused to treat him? He tried to sit up but collapsed back onto the bed, gripping the sides in pain. His breath was shallow, and the cold sweats started again. It was at that moment, as the room became dimmer, that something unexpected happened. A nurse burst into the room, her face pale. "Dr. Parker, you need to come quickly," she said, voice urgent. "The administrator is here." Dr. Parker, who had just been about to leave the ER, looked up in confusion. "What's going on?" The nurse didn't answer directly. "Just come, please." Without another word, Dr. Parker followed her down the hallway, his footsteps quickening. Mark was left alone, his thoughts racing. His body felt weaker with each passing second. And then, as though out of nowhere, there was a knock at the door. A man, tall and dressed in a sharp suit, stepped into the room. He was in his late 40s, with piercing blue eyes and a serious expression. "Mr. Lopez," the man said, his voice calm but authoritative. "How are you feeling?" Mark blinked in confusion. I'm not sure. Who are you?" The man smiled slightly. "My name is Alexander Grant. I'm with St. Michael's administration. I heard about your situation." Mark's heart raced again. "But they won't help me. They said without insurance I'm not getting treated." Alexander Grant's expression softened. "That's because they didn't know who you were. But now that I'm here, things are different." Before Mark could ask what he meant, the door opened again, and Dr. Parker entered, looking flustered. "What's going on, Mr. Grant?" he asked. The administrator turned to Dr. Parker with a quiet intensity. "You just turned away a man who could have saved your hospital millions. Mr. Lopez here is the head of the Lopez Foundation, one of the largest charitable organizations in the country. He's responsible for funding countless medical initiatives, including those that directly benefit hospitals like this one." Dr. Parker froze. His face turned pale as realization hit him like a ton of bricks. "Mr. Lopez? I didn't know." Alexander turned back to Mark, who was still lying on the gurney, stunned. "I'm so sorry, Mr. Lopez. The hospital owes you an apology for how you've been treated. But now, we'll make sure you get the care you need immediately." Mark, still reeling from the events unfolding, nodded slowly, his mind struggling to catch up. "I never wanted to make a scene. I just needed help." Dr. Parker, now visibly shaken, approached Mark. "I was wrong. I should never have judged you based on your insurance status. Please, let me do what's necessary to help." As Dr. Parker and the hospital team worked to get Mark the care he needed, Mark couldn't help but think about how differently everything would have gone if they had known who he was from the start. In that moment, he realized the importance of seeing people for who they truly are, not for the labels or the social status attached to them. Meanwhile, in the conference room down the hall, Alexander Grant spoke with Dr. Parker, making it clear that such an incident could not happen again. St. Michael's reputation was on the line, and there was no room for prejudice in a place meant to heal. Mark's surgery was successful, and he recovered in the days that followed. But the events of that day stayed with him. He had learned something powerful, the value of compassion and humility, especially from those who are in positions of power. In the end, it wasn't the wealth or status that mattered. It was the person Mark had always been, a humble, hard-working man who wanted nothing more than to live for his family. Dr. Parker, deeply humbled by his mistake, took steps to personally reach out to Mark, apologizing profusely for the oversight. Mark accepted his apology, but he also encouraged the doctor to learn from this experience and to always remember that everyone deserves a chance, regardless of their financial situation. This story serves as a powerful reminder that we should never judge others based on assumptions or status. Mark's true identity wasn't what mattered in the moment. It was his humanity, his need for care, and the injustice he faced simply because of a lack of insurance. In the end, the lesson is clear. Compassion should always come first, and it's never too late to make things right.